The IMF have downgraded their global economic growth predictions as a result of various global economic challenges. They list Brexit as one cause, but also the trade war that the United States and China are engaging in. I spoke to Jonathan Arnott, independent MEP for the North East of England, to discuss the impact trade wars can have and what they can accomplish. The IMF argued that the trade war could make the world a poorer and more dangerous place. I asked Jonathan if he agreed with that assessment.
Certainly in terms of poorer, I would. And the reason for that is that essentially anything that you do in terms of trade is a little bit of a quid pro quo. It's a bit of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of approach. You sell something, it benefits your businesses to sell it, and the people who are buying it, well, it benefits them because they're able to buy something at a lower price than they could make it for themselves. I mean, that's sort of almost by definition going to be the case, because otherwise they wouldn't go through the trouble of importing it, they'd just buy it locally. So in one sense, trade is something which is beneficial to both sides. And when you add additional taxes, additional tariffs on an import or on an export, then it's going to mean that you lose that benefit to both sides. And you may well get something that's slightly less useful in return. So, for example, you stick on a huge tariff on imported aluminium, and you will then find that it does benefit your own aluminium industry, but the problem is that it's going to cost you an awful lot more because anything that your country might want that uses that aluminium, all of that is going to go up in price, and so it'll have then a knock-on effect on other businesses around your economy. So certainly in terms of economics, it's sort of fairly settled in economics. There's this theoretically proven result that effectively if you tax imports, you might just as well have taxed exports, and that they're basically equivalent, they're basically the same thing. So yes, I think when you end up with some kind of trade war, then that is always going to make people poorer. Whether it makes the world a more dangerous place is a much more complicated question. It's a question that sort of it asks you to look behind and to ask, well, what is the consequence of that? Does it cause political instability in China, for example? Would political instability in China necessarily be a good thing or a bad thing? And you can certainly say that China's dictatorship is quite brutal, quite repressive in a number of ways, and it does harm people, particularly Christians in China find there's very little freedom at times. So certainly I would say that it would be something that would be destabilising. What is much, much harder to do is to look into the future and to say, what would the consequence of such instability actually be? Would it make the world more dangerous, or would it put pressure on a dictatorship?
So on a governmental level, on an international level, it could put pressure on a dictatorship, on a country that is maybe oppressing their people. How about trade wars, I guess, on the individual level for the people just living in the country day by day? How do they trickle down and impact those people?
The obvious thing is simply the price that people pay for goods in shops. You look at an American citizen who's going to Walmart or wherever to do their shopping, and the things that they buy that are often imported from China at very cheap prices, you slap tariffs on those, and suddenly the price that the American public is paying for those goods goes up dramatically and quickly. Now, that kind of price rise, if you're somebody who's one of the poorest people, who's really sensitive to price rises, it's going to hurt the poorest people the most. Now, that being said, in everything in economics, there's always a trade-off. There's always going to be the trade-off between that and the potential that what is effectively economic protectionism is going to protect a certain number of local jobs in the USA. So clearly what Donald Trump is doing here is he's looking at protecting workers in the USA from cheaper imports from China. If you do that, though, the consequence of that will be that prices go up. So everything's a quid pro quo, and the question is it worth doing it, given the impact that it will have on citizens' daily lives?
So why are China and the United States locked in this trade war? What has been the main cause for this conflict, for lack of a better word, and what are they hoping to accomplish if Donald Trump is seeking to protect his workers from cheap Chinese imports, but at the same time is now seeing prices go up for various other imports?
Yeah, I mean that last part is simply a trade-off. It's simply a balance, and my view, generally speaking, is that I would rather have free markets than higher and higher and higher taxes, which lead to then the other side reciprocating, and then it makes it harder for you to export to them, and then that hurts your jobs as well. So my view is general, this kind of escalation ends up being bad overall for the economy, even if there are some specific areas where some workers might benefit. And I think this is the difference perhaps between now and the 1980s. Because if you go back 30 years ago, trade between the USA and China would have been very one-sided. It would have all been the USA importing from China, whereas now certainly there is a substantial US export market to China as well. So that is certainly going to be something that's in the background. You asked why this is happening now, and as ever, in anything, in politics, in economics, there's never a very simple, single reason why something's happening. There are usually a lot of different reasons. One of the specifics that has rumbled on over the last few years is that China has effectively state-subsidized some of its businesses. And here is a point where I do have some sympathy with the US government on this. So where China has, in one way or another, effectively sold commodities below cost price, where they've effectively made it very, very cheap for a factory to operate so that it's able to sell, for example, steel and dump that on world markets below cost price in a way that nobody could possibly compete. Now, if that's something that happens, China's not going to do that forever. They might do that for a few years for strategic reasons so that they get some form of dominance in that market. Having done so and having sold things below cost price on global markets for a number of years, once they've got that dominance, they're not going to continue to sell them below cost price, but it's not in their economic interests long term to do so. But when they then put their prices up, if they don't have the competition that we've seen in the UK, where we've lost a number of steel firms, including in my constituency in Redcar, one of the reasons that that's happened is that when you've got things being sold below cost price on global markets, there is no way that you can compete them. There are many other reasons why that's happened, but that's certainly one of the reasons. So what you then find is that there is a necessity in those situations to retaliate in some way to that. So there is a need, I believe, to effectively take anti-dumping measures to prevent that from happening and to effectively tax the distortion that China has brought into the market. So there's certainly that reason behind it. There's also this feeling, I think, that China is very much taking a global approach. It's trying to buy more and more and more globally. So it already holds, I think, over $1 trillion of US government debt. And this feeling that China is using the economy as a political tool, a political weapon, is a reason, I think, that Donald Trump is very wary. So there are certainly factors, there are certainly reasons why the US might be looking at something like this to try to curtail China's behavior in certain areas. Now, the question is, what is it? Is this something which is a classic Donald Trump bluff, where he goes in all bluff and bluster, and actually the other side says, you know what, we don't want this, we're going to take a step back? And if that happens and if that succeeds, then you've got to say, hold your hands up, he's actually done a very good job at that, and he's pushed the other side in that way. But if it just leads to an out-and-out trade war, and this is the danger, and this is what the IMF is warning about now, if that leads to the trade war actually happening, and you slap tariffs on here, they slap tariffs on there, so you slap some more on, that is something which doesn't just affect US-China trade, but it sort of spills over, and it will have an impact, certainly in Europe too, and perhaps more so in France and Germany than the UK, but it certainly will have an international impact if that happens, and that's the danger here.
That was Jonathan Arnott, Independent MEP for the North East of England.